Dean Baquet feature, Truth in the 21st Century. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and former executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, discusses challenges of communicating truth with courage in the modern era. Baquet will examine the difficulties faced to maintain objectivity and independence in some of the top stories of the past 20 years, the state of newspapers in America, and the growing importance of local investigative journalism. Moderating this session is Lisa Wananen-Jones, a Lester M. Smith Distinguished Professor of Journalism and Media Production at the Murrow College of Communication. She specializes in data reporting and visualization, visual communication, and rural journalism. She was part of the New York Times team awarded the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. With a professional background as a local reporter in Spokane and as a graphics reporter at the New York Times, she now teaches visual communication, web video journalism, and data visualization. Please welcome Lisa Wananen-Jones.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's really great to see a full room and so many students especially who I'm really glad could make it today for this really excellent panel. And I know that you already got a chance to meet with some of our students yesterday as well. So we're going to jump right in with questions related to the theme of Truth in the 21st Century, which is the name of this panel. And you can tell already that this was named by somebody who's not a student, because for most of them that's basically just truth, or as they know it. But your experience goes back, many decades. So how do you think reporting the truth today is different from how it used to be when you were a young reporter?
Boy, that's a good question. Can you hear me okay? Is my mic working okay?
Yeah.
No? Is that better? Okay, I'll stay closer. Closer. Okay, gotcha. It's different in a lot of ways. First off, because of social media, people can actually, and because of the internet, people can actually test the truth themselves if they choose to. It used to be, if you can imagine, if there was a trial or a press conference, you really depended on television news probably coming in afterward and print newspapers coming in way afterward to tell you what happened. You can actually, if you choose to, look at stuff yourself. If you get even move beyond news, if you want to watch a museum show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and see for yourself if it's controversial, you can actually call up their website and look at it. So in a lot of ways that poses a challenge. That's a good thing, obviously, but it poses a challenge for news organizations because it means people can test their accuracy more. And as I always say, news organizations by their very nature are flawed, and we make mistakes, and people can call out our mistakes more easily than they could. But the one thing that I'll add that's a little, so all that's good. The one thing that I'll add that's a little more perilous is that it also means that there's so much information coming at people. Some of it not verified, some of it from sources that aren't necessarily trustworthy. There you go. So that's a little bit of a challenge, right? You can find, sadly, whatever version of the truth you want to. If you decide that you don't want to hear anything bad about a political candidate, you can wallow in only good things about the political candidate and never read anything bad about the political candidate. So that's bad, and that's the most perilous issue we face, I think.
I've been asked to ask about objectivity, which is kind of a loaded term in journalism these days. And so we're going to start with an easy one. You're on the record as generally supporting objectivity. Yeah. What does that mean to you?
I actually think that the debate over objectivity has been reduced, frankly, if you don't mind my saying, by some academics, to an almost silly degree. Nobody is objective. You can't possibly be objective. Whether I'm editing a story or reporting a story, I go into it with my baggage, right? I'm a black man from the South of a certain generation. That you can't take that out of your head. Nobody can do that. Objectivity is a process. It was the process that was created to make sure that everybody's baggage didn't skew coverage. So objectivity is the process of being edited. It's the process of a news organization sort of testing the truth before it publishes. My definition I think that to be truly objective, what it really means is that you approach a story with empathy and with an open mind. And you're willing to take information in that challenges your beliefs. And that to me is what it is. And that last part is vital. It means that you're willing to report out a story, and if you get on an airplane to report a story, and if you already think what the story is already, well, that's of no value to anybody. Don't even get on the plane. Which means you have to be willing to listen to stuff that challenges what your assumptions are. And that even challenges your history a little bit. So that's my long-winded definition of objectivity.
There was a recent commentary by Marty Barron in the Washington Post, and I think you talked to some students about that yesterday. It mentioned that we always want it was in favor of objectivity, and worth a read for all of you out there.
Mm-hmm.
And it mentioned that we sort of made analogies that we want objectivity in our doctors and our police officers. And when I read that, I thought it was kind of an interesting analogy, because I don't know that we always do want objectivity in other professions, or perhaps just goes back to that definition. You know, for instance, with doctors, there's a lot of evidence that, for instance, black women have really just tragically bad health outcomes for maternal health, and having black doctors improves that.
Yeah.
So even if the process is the same, there obviously are characteristics that make some sort of difference in that process.
Yes, but you don't. Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
But you don't want your doctor to walk in and say, and again, this is the problem with trying to have like a perfect definition of objectivity. What I think Marty meant was, you don't want the doctor to come in and say, "Oh God, this guy has torn jeans." That is going to increase the likelihood that he's going to, that he's a slob. That's what you don't want. You want the doctor to come in and say, "This is a person, a human body, and I'm going to draw my conclusions about his or her health based on my examination, not influenced by the fact that they showed up in a public hospital and they don't have any money, and not influenced by the fact that they showed up in a private hospital and they have lots of money." To me, that's what he was trying to say.
Yeah. And I don't think it's a conflict. I think also just with this, you've acknowledged too that identity is not something you leave behind. Like
That's
that
right.
matters
That's
a lot.
right.
And you've also done a lot of work to build a more diverse newsroom and have more diverse journalists in the industry, and have seen change in that in your career for sure. Do you think identity and objectivity are in conflict, or do you think those things work together?
I think they work together. I mean, I think the reason the example I always use is the newsrooms I started in, put race over here for a second, but the newsrooms I started in, women had no power. And women only, I started in the 1970s. So women wrote for the feature sections, and they covered gardening. When women gained power in newsrooms, when women gained the ability to influence coverage, to be reporters, to be top editors, to be copy editors, to the whole 9 yards, of course it changed the coverage. They brought a different perspective. And it meant, and again, my view is that objectivity is a process, it meant that process was more honorable and honest. It meant that there were different heads in trying to figure out what the right story was, what the closest, because you don't get to total truth on many stories because they're too complicated. So the goal is to get as close as you can to the truth, and as honorable and in as honorable a way as you can, owning up to the fact that journalism by its very nature is a deeply flawed craft. It just has to be.
I think one thing we see with students today, and I know you've had experiences with sort of generational differences and shifts in how journalists see their jobs. One thing I really see is a growth in empathy, which is something you've talked about, to an extent that it sometimes can be almost paralyzing. There's a fear of doing harm in a way that prevents young journalists from, I think, seeking the full truth in some cases. How do you maintain empathy while also, being ambitious and going after the story?
I think that if you ask me to somehow list the sort of some of the big fundamental issues, existential issues that are going to affect journalism in the coming years, that question sort of gets to it. I do think, I really do believe in empathy, and that means empathy for the people we write about as well as for each other, right? I do find that sometimes people, and I do think that my generation didn't think hard enough about the impact of its stories on people and their lives. I do, and that's why you saw when people wrote about, you know, rural America or any subject that they weren't quite familiar with. That's why you often saw people get it wrong and not think about it and not think, well, you know, how will this affect people? But if you carry that too far, and you're afraid of upsetting the people you write about, and you're afraid of upsetting your audiences, and if your empathy is so powerful that it gets in the way of truth, and it makes you afraid to take on certain subjects, well, that's not journalism to me. Because you have to be able to take on subjects that make you uncomfortable. And sometimes the truth makes the people you write about uncomfortable. Sometimes, you know, the truth makes you uncomfortable. But if you're afraid, if you're afraid of upsetting the people you write about, and again, you should be wary of upsetting the people you should think about it. But if you're afraid of it, carry that through. Then you're only going to write stories that make people happy, and you know there are publications that do that. But I'm not sure those are the ones I would necessarily want to spend all my time working for.
Do you have any examples of stories like that where you stuck with it even though you knew it was making people uncomfortable or had conflicted feelings about it?
Yeah, I think, for instance, I think that the issue of policing, which we did a lot of in-depth reporting about after the George Floyd case, I think that policing is a very complicated issue in American cities. I mean, I grew up in a poor neighborhood in New Orleans, which has one of the highest crime rates in America. I don't think the people I grew up with want to defund the police. I think they want better police. And I think that there were people when we wrote about policing who wanted us to just sort of be completely antagonistic toward the whole idea of policing. And I think that we need to be tough-minded and skeptical of police. And frankly, I think journalists of my generation were not skeptical enough and just quoted police. But I think we did stories that made people uncomfortable because there were cases in which we went in and we knocked on the doors of people who said, no, I don't want to defund the police. I just want better police. And I think that made people uncomfortable. But there's a lot of that. I mean, I've said this to some of the student groups. Abortion is a very difficult issue in American society. There are people who are very liberal, who on the issue of abortion are very conservative, and vice versa. I mean, I say that as somebody who grew up in a very religious family in the South. And I don't think we should be afraid to try to understand those differences. And I don't think we should be afraid to antagonize the people we write about when we explore those differences that people have on that subject. It's complicated.
I want to talk about criticism a little bit, which...
Can we not talk about criticism? Of me or of other people here?
We can do a little of both. I think it comes with working at the New York Times that you are criticized all day long. And I think to some extent then, you know, we talk about developing a thick skin or, you know, not worrying about that. But I've always been surprised pleasantly that when I work at the New York Times, reporters, editors, everyone's very responsive to reader concerns, to criticism. And I wonder how you balance, you know, what criticism do you listen to, both externally and internally as well, and what do you decide is not worth it?
You know, it's really hard. Because, and look, I was the editor of the New York Times for 8 years, and before that I was the managing editor of the LA Times. And that's a lot of years of criticism. And yes, I developed a thick skin, but anybody who tells you that they don't take some of that stuff a little bit personally is either kidding themselves or kidding you. What I tried to do was to isolate a handful of critics who I knew didn't like everything we did, but who I thought were thoughtful about it. And I would try to stick to them. I mean, I'll use a perfect example. I mean, of media critics, Eric Wemple for the Washington Post would beat me up and beat the New York Times up and do some deep reporting about our mistakes. And I didn't always agree with him, and I think he probably got some stuff, wrong in a way. But I thought he really reported, and he was really honest, and I would read him all the time. Other critics who I thought just sort of didn't do that reporting and didn't work hard to understand how decisions were made, I just paid less attention to them. So I think you gotta like find the critics, if you can, who you trust, and just hold in your stomach and read them. As far as internal criticism, I think that's a different issue, and that's important. Boy, like there's nothing more important than to shut up and listen to your staff sometimes. There's a lot of times you have to say, okay, I'm sorry, I actually do have to make this decision now, and you may not like it, but I'm going to make it. But you got to listen to your staff, because the makeup of the staff and the voices of the staff and the tensions that come in from a news staff, that to me is the process of objectivity. It's like I remember having lunch with a young reporter who I knew disagreed with me a lot about stuff, and but I thought she was a terrific reporter, and I took her to lunch, which was a little bit tense. She looked at me and she said, "Did you think when you hired people like me, we were just going to be just like you, but younger?" And I thought, okay, you got me. So.
Do you think it's harder managing journalists who are not afraid to ask the tough questions?
Sure it is. But, I mean, if you haven't, our newsroom is like almost 2,000 people now. If everybody just agrees with me all the time, I'd probably be able to leave at 5 o'clock, and I'd have no tension in my life. But that would not be a lot of fun, and it wouldn't be a great report.
Yeah. I know that a lot of external criticism is really coming from a place where people don't understand how the news process works or don't have sufficient news literacy. To what extent do you think that has, changed or influenced the way that you have published stories?
You and I talked about this a little bit earlier. I think that we developed a secret code in the print era, and then we don't get the fact that nobody understood it. I told you the horrifying story when I was at the LA Times, and a new, not particularly bright, executive came into the company, Tribune company, and in the course of the conversation, it was at the height of either the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. We started talking about the reporters being there and safety, and he said, "They're there?" And I looked at him horrified. I said, "Yeah, that's what that dateline means when it says Kabul." And I thought, when I got over the fact that felt like a dumb question to me, why do we think that all the millions of people who read newspapers understand that secret code we have, that little word Kabul, tells them, we think that tells them so much stuff, that a reporter is in the region, that the reporter is risking their lives, that the reporter is away from her family, that the reporter knows the subject, that we expect in that little tiny dateline for you to take away all this amazing information. And how could you take that away, So I think what we've learned to do, and we have a long ways to go, is to explain ourselves. We've learned to okay, here's who this reporter is. Now we would say, in the case of this reporter, Alyssa Rubin has been covering the war in Afghanistan from the very beginning, and before that she covered the war in Iraq, and she's been at the New York Times for X number of years, and here's who she is. And that to me gives credibility, and we didn't do that for a long time, and we're better at it now. We still have more work to do.
The Times has expanded a lot of features like inside the newsroom and features like that. Do you find that has been helpful? Do you think that is an improvement from the past when that wasn't as possible? Yeah, it's helpful. I think we still get a little bit too much. I blame myself for this because those things started in my time as editor. We can get a little too much. There's a line between being a little too celebratory and aren't we cool, and we have a morgue and we have a museum. There's a line between that and really trying to help you to understand how we are finding out the things we're telling you. And I think sometimes, we slop over, too far into the other line. But I think it helps. I think when we published, when we got hold of Donald Trump's taxes, and we published them, somebody said, there are going to be some. I thought, wow, this is great, right? This is like such a great scoop. And somebody said, there are going to be people
who want you to explain why you're making public a citizen's taxes, even though he's president of the United States, right? And I thought, well, so I wrote a little essay to accompany the story that just said, here's why we're publishing this stuff. Here's why it's important. Here's why Donald Trump's taxes are worth making public. I wouldn't have done that, 5 years ago. Nobody would have thought of it, and we wouldn't have done it.
Since we're talking about Trump.
Who?
Everybody's reading the news on their phone, I think. How has covering that administration and that time, that election, there's been a lot of changes and just impact on democracy in the U.S. How has the newsroom responded to that, and how has that affected your approach to anything personal?
It's been a real challenge, and it's been eye-opening, and I think it's offered a look at some of our bad habits. Newspapers, and when I talk about news, forgive me, I'm talking about newspapers because that's the world I grew up in. Newspapers are, we hate to say this, we like to talk about the beauty of our writing, etc. We're also manufacturing plants. We develop habits in the way we write. We develop habits in the way we edit. We develop habits in the way we write headlines, the size of the headlines, the placement of stories. And we have to do all that to actually put the thing out every day, right? I think Trump, threw a gauntlet at that whole process. Because, yes, we've had politicians who lie, but we were the first news organization, nobody remembers this, to actually say on the front page that Donald Trump, the candidate, told that he was lying. I don't think we've ever done that. But he was so over the top that we needed a way to distinguish him from the politicians who just merely, obfuscate. And that was there's been a lot of that. And look, we've been imperfect in the way we've covered him. Of course we have. The rule was, pre-Donald Trump, is every time the president said anything, you wrote about it, you took it seriously. Well, in comes a guy who says stuff all the time, makes stuff up, lies, as we've said in our news pages, and you have to struggle with, but don't people have the right to, not the right, shouldn't people hear what he has to say and make the judgment for themselves? It was interesting, by the way, rereading one of the biographies of Edward R. Murrow. Because essentially what he did with Joseph McCarthy, if you go back and look at that, he essentially just put up his own words, right? And you can make the judgment for yourselves. But that's a real test with Trump. So to end, I think we have had to change the rules. I'm not saying we've done them, we've always done it perfectly. I think I've acknowledged that we're imperfect. But somehow you can't change the rules so much that when everything settles down a little bit, you're left with whole new rules. All of a sudden the word lie becomes, my rule was, we will use the word lie. Many people say they don't think we ever did it. We did it probably more than any other news organization. We will use the word, but I want to sign off on it. I don't want to read a story on page, 827 that says the mayor of Sarasota said his budget was going to be $50 million, but it's $51 million, and then therefore he's a liar. That's you don't want the word to become cheap and to lose its power.
My kids are at the phase where if you say something like, you can have dessert after lunch, and then we're in a rush and we don't, they say, oh, you lied about it. And it's like, have dessert later, I promise. I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about COVID data too, and I wanted to touch on that. By
the way, do you all know how, I want to make sure that you all know how important that, I think that's one of the most creative reporting projects any news organization has ever done, so we should give her a round of applause.
No. It is a pleasure to work at the New York Times because you're always a teeny little piece of everything, and you're surrounded by other excellent people so that you are never out there completely on your own. And I imagine you feel that way too.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
it was a really interesting project. So the part that I was involved with was collecting this data, in part because the US has a decentralized healthcare system and the federal government wasn't doing it at that time. And what we found is that the federal government wasn't that well positioned to do it anyway, because these records are held in these local health departments, which are chronically underfunded and just run in incredibly different ways. So we released this data, and I think the part that we talked about was that once it's out there, we kept track of how people were using it. And there were lots of great uses in research and local news and all of that. But we also see people using it to their own ends, right? So once it's out there, you see people interpreting it to basically fit the narrative that they wanted to fit, and especially as COVID restrictions and other things became more politicized, we saw, what we thought was, objective work and valuable being used in a lot of different ways. And so that's kind of the question of, are we responsible for how people use our reporting if it is feeding misinformation or being used in ways that we don't intend?
Ben Smith, who was the media columnist for the New York Times when I was the editor, told me once, and I think he was right, we need to be aware of the possibilities that people will use the information we come up with, for bad purpose. We need to be aware of the impact. But my view is you can't, that does not mean you should not report, that does not mean you should not present the information. If you play it out, if you picture a world where your decisions about what to report, as long we're talking factual, verified stuff, right? If you picture a world where you're so afraid that the information you report will be used by people for bad purposes, picture what that looks like. That means that you're going to start picking your shots based on how you think people will interpret it. And if you play that out, that's pretty dangerous stuff. I mean, that means that you are not going to report truthfully and honestly. You're going to report, Fox News' biggest problem right now, the whole issue of the Dominion suit, is that they were afraid to piss off their audiences, right? If you get to be afraid, if you're afraid to piss off your audiences, you're afraid that somebody will take your information and twist it, you're like, I don't know what's left to report in that case. So I think you need to be aware. You need to say, okay, I know that some people will read Donald Trump's tax returns and say, this is brilliant. He's avoided paying taxes for a generation, okay? I guess some people, in fact, did interpret it that way. He's really smart. That's how he interpreted it. I can't control that, and I'm not going to. The alternative for me would be, well, I'm actually not going to report his tax returns because some people are going to interpret it the wrong way. That can't be the answer to me.
Well, we're thinking about audience. How do you see the audience or readers of the New York Times? Who do you think of when you're designing this and putting the information out there?
It's funny. I grew up in a world where we didn't think about audience. Which I now understand was wrong-headed. I grew up, I remember literally working in the newsroom of the New Orleans paper in like 1977, 1978, and you pick up the phone and it was a reader, and you would just hang up. Why are you bothering me? That seems appalling to you. I promise you, everybody of my generation has a story like that. We just thought they were like, what are you doing? And that was because you had to buy the paper, right? You had no choice. You wanted to sell your house, you had to buy the paper. You wanted to sell your car, you had to buy the paper. You wanted to know if it was going to rain, you had to buy the paper. So we were arrogant schmucks who didn't listen. Now we understand that we have to listen to readers, and that's good, that's healthy. I try not to have, I know what the demography of the New York Times audience is. I try not to have that overly influence choices we make. For tons of reasons, right? I don't think it's a secret that the New York Times, because it's expensive, doesn't have as many poor readers as some other news organizations. I don't want to make that, you'd never want to say, well, I'm not going to write stories that affect the lives of poor people, right? What your goal should be to, in my mind, if anything, I have an aspirational reader, or an aspirational group of readers who are a mix of incomes and geography. That's actually more possible today because you can get some free stories, and also because the paper is much more available than it was when it was a paper. But I try not to. I mean, I assume that the readers of the New York Times have a certain curiosity. I think that's the only thing that I want to have in my head, that they're curious, that they actually want to know stuff, that they want to understand stuff. They want to read the COVID tracker. They want to understand how people are dying, and that's the only thing. That's the only thing I try to have in my mind. I assume they're curious and they want to know stuff. So.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we will open it up for audience questions. So if you have one, you can think about how you want to ask it. My last question I want to ask is a little bit more lighthearted, but I think a serious question too. Yeah, which is about Wordle. But
can I say
seriously.
one thing about Wordle? So my son, who's not a journalist, happened to tell one of his friends that his father was the editor of the New York Times, and his reaction was, "Oh my God, your father is the editor of Wordle?" Anyway, go ahead. I have nothing to do with Wordle, by the way. Go ahead.
I do want to ask about that, though. I think the New York Times has been successful in part because of incorporating products like cooking and the Wirecutter and all these services. How do you see that working together with the news side to, serve the public and readers?
I mean, I'll say two things. I think one of the things that frankly, I think the New York Times has turned a corner in the last few years, and one reason is, frankly, because I think the newsroom participated, the newsroom played, the newsroom understood that we were going to have to be different and change. In my own mind, I think that Wordle and the cooking app and the Daily and all those things, it's sort of a modern replica of the print paper as it was, at its biggest. You had an A section with news, you had a business report, you had a feature section, you had styles, you had all these sections, and people, participated in the news in any way they choose. Some people only read the book review, and some people read the culture report first. I mean, nobody ever read cover to cover except us, probably. So in my own mind, that collection of stuff is a modern repetition of that. Like, Wordle is the modern day version of the crosswords, and lots of people just bought the New York Times for the crosswords. The Daily is a modern version of a different kind of thoughtful ideas section. So that I sort of see it all as the same thing, produced for the most part, with the exception of things like Wordle, produced in the newsroom. The cooking app is produced in the newsroom. The Daily is produced in the newsroom. And I think that what the lesson I think we took away from that is the newsroom's got to be willing to play if you're really going to save your news organization. And I don't mean play on business, and I don't mean play on bending ethics, but it's got to open its mind to all the possibilities, which are endless now. So.
Great, thank you. We'll go to questions, and as a point, it has been a while now, but I was once editor of the Evergreen here. Our current editing staff is here today. And if we ever thought people weren't picking up the paper, you could just mess up the crossword clues one day, and you get calls all day long. So who's got a question? And we'll take some.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do we need to use a different one?
I can just speak loudly.
Yeah, we'll repeat the question if it does.
So you said you worked at LA Times and New York Times. Which one did you like more and why?
Ooh.
That's
This is why we go to the audience.
my rule is I try to answer every question. I'm not going to touch that. No, each I love both those papers. I really do, and I'm not being a diplomat. They were meaningful to me at different points. I mean, of course I love the New York Times more, if I'm being honest. I was at the New York Times for the last 12 years. I loved the LA Times then, and I love it now. But of course I love the New York Times more. I mean, the last decade of 8 years of my life I ran it, and the last 12 years of my life I was in that newsroom every day, and I love that newsroom very much. No, I think I've hit my course of papers that have the word Times in it.
So when an incident such as a mass shooting occurs, how does the New York Times handle having to cover that?
Unfortunately, we've covered a lot of those. When I was national editor for the New York Times when the first run of those, for those who remember Columbine, Jonesboro, that was in the 1990s when I ran the coverage of those. My first editing, quite a school shooting, but my first editing experience was flying to Oklahoma City and running the Times' coverage of the bombing of the Murrah building. You try to figure out ways to cover those stories differently than you've covered them in the past. Speaking of empathy, there are things we didn't do before. We try not to glorify the shooters. We sort of generally don't put a picture of the shooters on the front page or prominently on the website. There's been enough, that's not something we thought about 10 years ago. That's to your question about impact. There's been enough research that encourages people. But frankly, they're big news stories, and we cover them, and we try to understand the shooter, and we try to make sure that we give life and tribute to the victims too. And then we ask the hard questions that we ask every time about guns and gun violence. And sadly, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference. And sometimes you have to park your I don't want to say cynicism, but sure I'll say sometimes you have to park that at the door and just do it all over again. The saddest thing about news, bad news, tragedies, is they happen all the time. And you still have to cover them, and you can't walk away from them. Who's picking? Oh, good, you are.
Hi, I'm a professor here. So recently, the New York Times has had a lot of pushback on their op-ed section, especially because it seems like it is pushing an anti-trans agenda. How do you deal with objectivity in the op-eds?
Well, the good news is that's the one part of the newsroom that I didn't run. I don't know if people know how it's set up. So the newsroom, I run everything but opinion. So I ran. If the New York Times Tom Friedman, for instance, doesn't work for me. But some of the pushback has been at the newsroom. So I will try to answer it. Look, I think that there's a dramatic transformation in society that we have to cover. And sometimes, I think you can do that without having an anti-trans agenda or without questioning the humanity of people who make that choice. But I still think there are some unresolved medical and scientific issues that are worth writing about and covering. You can ask the opinion editor, from their perspective, but that's my perspective. I do think there are some questions that we have to cover and discuss, even if it makes people uncomfortable.
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, cool. I'm Laura Campbell. Good to meet you. I am from Wazoo Everett. It's a Wazoo Extension campus. These are all my friends. Say hi. My question is related to the acquisition of smaller news organizations by Sinclair. How has that been a game changer in the media field, and what would you like to say about that?
Look, I don't think Sinclair in its history has been sort of a player that you want to own a lot of news organizations. I don't think it's grappling with the issues of fairness and balance that I've discussed here. So the acquisitions by politically driven and ideologically driven news organizations make me really uncomfortable. I don't want to give a speech about Sinclair. I'd have to do more homework and more reporting. But generally speaking, I think you want news organizations to be owned and run by people who want to be fair and cover the communities and not push a political agenda, frankly, which is the best argument, by the way, for objectivity.
I'll add a quick plug as well that we aren't talking as much about local news here this morning, not because I don't care about it, but because there's another session this afternoon, so that would be a great time to have that as well.
Hi, hello. My name is Jamie Ness, and I'm a student here at WSU. And my question for you is, with you speaking about objectivity and bringing your badge of identity with you, how do you deal with people using your identity to question the objectivity or like the issues that you're writing on? Because this is your identity. You're writing about this issue in this way.
That's what I meant when I said objectivity is a process, and it's the process that takes place before a story is published. And what it means is that, you know, in its own imperfect way, the job of a news organization is to make sure that people's identities are part of the mix and part of the discussion. That's why you want a diverse newsroom. But that people's identities don't dictate truth, if you will, right? You know, and I think people who say to me, your identity must influence the New York Times' coverage, the answer is, of course it does. But my belief is that it influences it more toward the truth, because I'm not the only person in the New York Times newsroom. I have colleagues who challenge me. I have colleagues who are younger than me who say, you don't understand, you know, your generation doesn't understand X, and that's part of the process too. And out of all that stuff, all that discussion should come as close a version of the truth as you can get on deadline. So.
One of my things as being kind of in a leadership position is making sure I'm educating just the people under me. And I know that you've probably done a lot of interviews, you've been asked a lot of questions. So what are some questions that you appreciate reporters asking you, and what questions do you not really appreciate?
I don't mind reporters asking me any question, to be honest. I figure live by the sword, die by the sword. You know, I have, you know, a newsroom filled with reporters whose job it is to ask people hard questions. So I don't think I can get away with saying you don't get to ask me a hard question. So you can ask me anything, and even if I can't answer it, that's fine. But I don't think I get to say you can't ask me hard questions. What questions do I like being asked? I like being asked questions where we explain how we make decisions. I like being asked questions that humanize the institution. I mean, the New York Times, people think of it as this sort of monolithic institution where everybody went to Harvard and, you know, grew up in a, you know, on the Upper East Side in a, you know, fancy apartment, which is not the truth. And whenever I get a chance to talk about that, I welcome that. So.
Hi, thanks for being here this week. You spoke to your coverage of school shootings not making a difference in that they keep happening again. I'm on the other side of that. I'm wondering are there any stories or coverage that you've seen make a difference that you are particularly proud of?
Yeah, I mean, I was deeply involved in the coverage of Harvey Weinstein and Bill O'Reilly, and I don't think there's any question that changed the conversation about workplaces and power imbalances and sexual harassment and worse. Yeah, I think that I'm floored how much that changed the discussion. I thought you never expect when you run coverage, you never fully expect it to like have a big impact, and that had a huge impact. I also think, you know, I know it's controversial sometimes at universities, but I think the 1619 project, which I also authorized, changed the discussion a lot about, I mean, what I introduced Nicole at an event when it first came out. So I grew up in the South. And all the books so this is in like the early 1960s, my God. Nobody was born. The school wasn't here when I was in. So, you know, the books, the biographies for kids that were in the library at you know, my grammar school were heroic portraits of Confederate generals. I didn't understand that the people I was writing about actually, their goal was to keep my predecessors in slavery, right? And that a lot of Southerners got their education from books like that. And I think what 1619 did was to say, you know, there is a different side to the story that you need to understand. And I think that and Harvey Weinstein had huge impact on the national conversation. So I'm proud of both of them. So.
So you talked a lot about how journalists need to apply more kind of an empathetic view towards not only the subject we're interviewing, but also how we write to the audience. I guess where has been a situation where morally you've been in direct opposition to a subject you're interviewing, how difficult was it to kind of maintain your composure, and has there been a situation where that composure wasn't able to be maintained?
There have been a lot of instances, almost like daily, that we cover stories that you know, every president, every governor, every mayor I've ever been involved in covering in five newsrooms, we've covered things that they didn't like the perspective we were taking. That is the essence of journalism, is they ask hard questions, right? So so that's pretty common. I don't think I have a temper. I do. But one of the things I try to do is to keep that. I mean, I also have a newsroom filled with people who like look to me, you know, to be a leader. So if I have to like have a temper tantrum, I try not to do it. So I try to hold that in. But you can't worry about pissing off powerful people. That you just can't worry about that. That's like, it happens all the time. I don't think I've had. I mean, I'll give you an example. The hardest decisions you have to make when you're at a national news organization like the New York Times is when to publish things that are national security secrets. And I've probably in the course of my career had a dozen, if not more, instances where the government made the case to me not to publish something because it would, you know, create problems for somebody or violate national security. I remember once the head of the CIA actually convinced me not to publish something, and it was a stupid mistake by me. I should have published it. I woke up the next morning and I kicked myself. I should have published it because it didn't actually endanger lives. I understood. He said it did, but it didn't. I should have been more skeptical. But for the most part, people don't hear about it, but I say no. And I've done that through the Bush administration when I was the Washington bureau chief, through the Obama administration. Every administration has made a call like that to me. And all of them have like cited national security. And all of them have gotten pissed off when we published it anyway. And the only time I regret was the time I didn't publish it. So.
Hi, can you all hear me? Hi, my name is Jen. I'm also from WASU Everett. And you mentioned that you have worked with like younger generation like us. So could you tell us like an example of when you have to make a decision with facing the differences in ideas, disagreement even, with like younger generation? Yeah.
Yeah, pretty frequently. You know, I'm trying to think of a specific example. I think that the youngest, the next every generation. My friend Tom Rosenstiel, who wrote a book with Bill Kovach about the future of journalism. One of the two of them said, and I think it's true, every generation gets to make its own journalism. And I've had like arguments about objectivity with people in the newsroom who are younger. A lot of them grew up in a very, you know, difficult moment for the country. You know, the year of George Floyd and COVID is like a historic year in newsroom discussions. And there were people who, and the fact that you can now actually watch the video of George Floyd, which was infuriating and heartbreaking, made people wanna you know, cover that issue in a way that first off, they were right in saying to me, here's an example where I think that generation is right in saying that you guys meaning my generation, mostly guys, you guys were too easy to say police said and to just believe what the police say. That is true. And I was a police reporter, and whenever police said something happened, we wrote police said. We weren't skeptical enough. They were right about that. But my view, and that I insist on to them, is that everything you do still got to be grounded in reporting. You got to report. It's like, that is, that. So in my mind, you have like a bunch of principles that guide a news organization. And a lot of those principles are malleable. You know, how you write a news story, what video looks like. I mean, the world of graphics I started with was like, you know, give me a fever chart that shows the stock market's up. If I asked graphics to do that now, they'd slug me, and they'd be right. But the one thing that should not change for a great news organization is that reporting is king. And reporting doesn't mean just like writers. Reporting is photographers. Reporting is what went into the COVID tracker. That's reporting too. But reporting is king. And anybody who disagrees with that, my view is there are places you can work, but you can't really work for me, because reporting is king, is my view.
Thank you so much. We're going to end questions now so that everyone can get to the
Thank
next
you.
sessions. Thank you so much for being here and listening.